Firefighter finds Bobcat Cub, clinging to dead mother. Heartwarming story that went viral. It started with a distress call from a local hiker who had spotted a bobcat, possibly injured, near the hiking trail that wound around the foothills. The call had been vague, a mother bobcat in trouble with a cub close by. But Sean's training kicked in immediately. A wild animal in distress could mean more danger than anyone expected. He and his team arrived at the location in under an hour. The terrain rugged and steep as they made their way to the base of the trail. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, the kind of fresh, earthy scent that spoke of the changing seasons. The hiker, an older man named Bill, was standing off to the side, his face pale with concern. "There," Bill said, pointing to a small clearing just off the trail. Sean's eyes scanned the area, and that's when he saw her, the mother bobcat. She was lying still in the center of the clearing, her body unnaturally twisted. A tragic sight. Sean's gut tightened as he approached, knowing the look of death when he saw it. But what froze him in his tracks wasn't just the lifeless bobcat, it was the tiny figure clinging to her side. A bobcat cub, barely more than a few weeks old. The cub's fur was matted with dirt and blood, its tiny paws clutching to the lifeless body of its mother, desperate, trembling. The sight was heart-wrenching. The sheer vulnerability of the cub, alone in the wild, clinging to the one figure it had known for protection. It was a stark reminder of the brutality of nature, where survival wasn't guaranteed, and even the strongest could fall. For a long moment, Sean stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the cub's tiny whimpers, soft and fragile, like the last hope of something fighting to survive. It was clear the cub hadn't eaten in days, and its chances of making it on its own were slim. Sean knew what had to be done. The cub couldn't stay out here. With a deep breath, Sean approached slowly, not wanting to startle the cub. His training kicked in, his calmness taking over in the face of the raw emotion flooding through him. This was no ordinary rescue. This wasn't a person or a house or a building. This was something different, something deeper. And Sean, a firefighter, a rescuer by nature, knew what he had to do. Sean's heart raced as he moved closer to the cub, his footsteps soft against the forest floor. The tiny bobcat didn't move. It was as if it had resigned itself to its fate, curled up beside its mother, eyes wide and vacant, filled with fear and uncertainty. For a moment, Sean simply stood there, taking in the gravity of the situation. He wasn't sure if the cub even understood that help was on the way, or if it had already lost all hope. The mother, likely struck by a car or caught in a trap, lay unmoving, her death a tragic end to a life that was far too short. The cub, however, was a survivor. It still clung to its mother, and despite the odds, it hadn't given up. Sean knelt down slowly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to alarm the cub. The cub blinked at him, but it didn't move, too. Weak to react. He gently reached out and placed his hand near the cub's side, careful not to startle it. The tiny body was cold to the touch. Its fur was damp with dirt and blood, and it trembled violently under his hand. Sean felt a pang in his chest. "It's all right, little one," Sean murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel his own heart racing in response to the fear in the cub's eyes. His firefighter training had prepared him for countless rescues, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness he felt in this moment. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a fight against nature itself, a fight to give this small creature a chance at life, when everything around it seemed to be telling it to give up. Sean took a deep breath and gently scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it against his chest. The little bobcat let out a weak, pitiful whimper, but didn't fight. It seemed to understand that it was no longer alone. He stood up carefully, adjusting his grip to support the cub's fragile body. The weight of the situation hung heavy on his shoulders, but he wasn't about to let this little creature slip away. He turned to the team, signaling for them to head back to the truck. One of the other firefighters, Mike, moved forward, his eyes filled with concern. "What do we do now?" Mike asked, his voice low, knowing there were no easy answers in a situation like this. "We get it back to the station," Sean said, his tone firm yet filled with uncertainty. "We'll stabilize it, get it some food and water, and then figure out what comes next." The path back was slower with the cub in Sean's arms. Every step felt like an eternity, each one marked by the trembling of the small body he cradled so carefully. The cub's tiny breath was shallow, each one more fragile than the last. Sean's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept moving forward. He couldn't stop. Not now. As they reached the truck, Sean carefully placed the cub in a small crate, making sure it was as comfortable as possible. He closed the door and climbed into the front seat, his eyes lingering on the cub, still curled up in the crate, its tiny body barely rising and falling with each breath. The drive back to the station felt endless. Every bump in the road seemed to jolt him, making him wince at the thought of the cub suffering. He couldn't afford to lose this little life, not after everything it had already been through. But as they finally pulled into the station, Sean allowed himself a moment to hope. He wasn't sure what the future held for the cub, but he was certain of one thing: he wasn't going to let it give up. The fire station was quiet as Sean carefully carried the Bobcat Cub into the back room, the sounds of the engine and alarms, a distant memory. The team had already prepared a warm area for the cub, setting up blankets and a heating pad to provide some comfort. Sean carefully placed the cub on the makeshift bed and immediately began assessing its condition. It was weak, far weaker than he had expected. The tiny body shivered in his hands, barely able to keep its eyes open. Sean had seen his share of injuries, both human and animal, but this was different. The cub wasn't just injured physically, it was emotionally broken, clinging to its mother, the only figure in its young life that could provide comfort. Now it was alone. Sean's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. His first instinct was to reach out to wildlife rehabilitation experts, but he knew they wouldn't be able to help fast enough. The cub needed immediate care, and it was clear that every minute counted. "Let's get it some fluids," Sean said to Mike, who was standing beside him, his face a mask of concern. "We need to keep it hydrated before we can do anything else." Mike nodded and grabbed the necessary supplies: a syringe, electrolyte solution. Carefully, Sean began administering the fluids to the cub, holding it steady as it took in the small amounts of liquid. The cub didn't fight. It was too weak to do much more than blink at Sean with those wide, fearful eyes. But then, something happened. Slowly, as the fluids began to take effect, the cub's breathing steadied. The tremors in its body lessened just a little. Sean exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was something. The cub was responding. There was hope. As the day wore on, Sean and the team continued to work on the cub. They cleaned its wounds, fed it small amounts of meat, and kept it warm. Every so often, Sean would glance over at the small creature, wondering how much longer it could survive on its own. But it wasn't alone anymore. Not as long as Sean was there. By the time the sun began to set, the cub had perked up just enough to sit up on its own. It still looked fragile, its movements tentative, but it no longer seemed to be on the edge of death. Sean sat next to it, a sense of relief washing over him. The cub had made it through the first hurdle. "It's a fighter," Sean muttered, under his breath, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The cub looked up at him, its golden eyes reflecting the flickering light from the nearby lamp. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Sean felt a deep connection, not just to this little animal, but to the idea of resilience, of survival against all odds. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a symbol of what could be possible when everything seemed lost. As the night fell, Sean sat in the corner of the room, watching the cub curl up into the blankets, its tiny body still and peaceful, for the first time that day. But even as exhaustion settled in, he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This cub, this tiny life, was no longer alone in the world. The next few days passed in a blur of care and attention. Sean and his team worked tirelessly to keep the cub comfortable, ensuring it had everything it needed to heal. Slowly but surely, the Bobcat Cub began to show signs of recovery. It still couldn't move as quickly as it should, and it wasn't fully out of danger yet, but it was fighting, and Sean wasn't going to give up on it. But what neither Sean nor the team expected was the way their small rescue effort would spark something much larger. Word of the cub's miraculous survival had spread quickly, first to the local community, and then to the internet. A small video, posted by one of the firefighters showing the cub being gently cradled by Sean, its tiny body recovering, its soft eyes full of wonder, had gone viral. Soon the station's phones were ringing non-stop. People from across the country wanted updates, wanted to help, wanted to know how they could donate to support the cub. News outlets picked up the story, and before long, Sean found himself standing in front of a camera, explaining the details of the rescue to a reporter. The cub nestled in a soft blanket beside him. "It's nothing special," Sean had said modestly as the camera flashed. "We did what we're trained to do. We saw something in need and we helped." But to those who watched, it was more than that. It was the story of a small, helpless creature clinging to life, a story that resonated with anyone who had ever faced an impossible situation. The cub, against all odds, had made it. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the powerful bond between humans and nature. As the days passed, the attention only grew. The story was shared across social media, drawing in people from every corner of the globe. Some offered financial donations, others sent messages of encouragement. Wildlife organizations reached out, offering to help with the next steps for the cub once it was fully recovered. But despite the whirlwind of media attention and the growing number of offers to help, Sean remained focused on what mattered most: the cub's health. He and his team made sure to maintain the cub's recovery, allowing it the time and space it needed to regain its strength. There were still challenges ahead. The cub was far from ready to return to the wild. But for now, it was alive, and that was a victory. One morning, a week after the rescue, Sean sat beside the cub, who had now started to show more signs of playfulness. It pawed at a small ball that had been placed in its crate, swatting at it with a clumsy curiosity. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Mike, one of Sean's fellow firefighters, said as he watched the cub. "We all thought it was a lost cause." Sean nodded, his gaze fixed on the cub. "I think we all needed this, more than we realized." And in a way, it was true. The cub's rescue had become more than just a viral sensation. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light, and that sometimes, it's the smallest creatures, the ones that seem the most vulnerable, that show the greatest strength. Weeks had passed since the day Sean had first found the bobcat cub clinging to its mother's lifeless body. The tiny creature, once weak and fragile, had transformed before his eyes into a small, strong survivor. Every day, it grew more energetic, its movements becoming more confident as it regained its strength. The once faint whimpers had been replaced with small growls of curiosity, and the cub had started exploring its environment, its claws scraping against the wood of its crate as it climbed, its ears twitching at every new sound. But despite the improvement in the cub's health, Sean knew the time was coming. The cub was no longer the tiny, vulnerable creature that had been rescued from the forest. It was becoming more wild with every passing day, and soon it would be time to let go. The news about the cub had reached far and wide, and the local wildlife rehabilitation center had been closely monitoring its progress. The time had come for them to take over, to continue the cub's rehabilitation in a more natural environment, one where it could start learning to survive on its own again. The day the cub was to leave, Sean felt a strange mixture of emotions. He had grown attached to the little survivor, but he knew this was the right thing. The cub had survived because of the care it had received, but now it needed to learn how to live in the wild, to become the animal it was always meant to be. "Ready for the next chapter?" Mike asked as he stood beside Sean, watching the cub playing in its pen. The cub had become more active, jumping at the fences, testing its newfound strength. It was ready, and Sean, despite the lump in his throat, knew it too. Sean smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "As ready as I'll ever be." The wildlife center arrived with a transport crate, the cub's new home for the journey ahead. It was larger, equipped with everything the cub would need for the next leg of its journey: food, a safe environment, and a team who would help it transition into the wild. As the center's staff carefully placed the cub into the transport crate, Sean crouched down, his hand resting gently on the outside of the crate. "I'm gonna miss you, little one," Sean whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The cub, now more alert and aware than ever, paused for a moment and looked up at him through the bars of the crate. For just a second, Sean swore the cub recognized him, and in that look, Sean saw not just the animal he had rescued, but the animal that was now ready to be free. With the crate secured, the team loaded it into the truck. Sean and Mike stood in silence as they watched the vehicle drive off, taking the cub to its next stage of rehabilitation. It wasn't goodbye, not truly. The cub wasn't gone forever. It was just returning to the wild, where it belonged. That evening, as Sean sat outside the fire station, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought about the impact this little bobcat had had on his life. The whole town had rallied around the cub, and even as it moved on, Sean knew it had made a difference, not just in the cub's life, but in his too. It had reminded him that sometimes survival wasn't just about fighting the odds. It was about finding the strength to continue, no matter how hopeless things seemed. It was about giving everything a second chance. And as the fire station lights flickered on and the cool night air settled in, Sean looked up at the stars, feeling, for the first time in a long while, like he had witnessed something that would stay with him forever. The cub was free, and so, in a way, was he.